we are kind of in the middle of talking through sort of the question of whether, yes, the character of Jesus is essentially a fictionalized, coned, cleaned up character. Paul's been making the analogy with some of the movies, where we've seen the evolution of characters like Batman and Superman in different ways. And he says, well, couldn't it be the same with Jesus? Yes, maybe there was an original person, but the stories kind of changed shape, developed into this perfect, the person that you say, this is the reason why we can trust that this person really was who he claimed to be, Jesus, the Son of God. Actually, maybe it was just people kind of shaped him into that kind of character over time, Frank. So let's have a bit more back and forth between you on this, firstly with you, Frank, and then we'll come to the end.
Yeah, as I say, you need some other information from the outside to really make a determination as what makes the most sense, because all the writers of the New Testament, except for Luke, were all baptized Jews who believe Yahweh was their God. They already were God's chosen people. They had no motive to invent any of this. They had every motive to say it wasn't true, not every motive to say it was true, because by saying a man claimed to be God, first of all, that was blasphemy. They didn't think a man could claim to be God. They didn't think somebody would rise from the dead in the middle of time. They only thought somebody would rise from the dead at the end of time. So for them to say that a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead in the middle of time, when they had no motive to say otherwise, could only really be explained by a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead in the middle of time, because they got beaten, tortured, and killed for saying this was true, and they had no motive to invent it. So I don't see this as an invented story. Our friend J. Warner Wallace, the cold case homicide detective, says whenever he finds a dead body that he knows has been murdered, he says there's only 3 reasons why that guy's dead. There's not 1,000 reasons. There's only 3, or one of these 3, or a combination thereof. There was either a sex issue, a money issue, or a power issue. And so he said, if you're going to try and say that a conspiracy was done here or people invented this, you'd have to have one or more of those 3 motivators. And I don't see the I don't see the New Testament writers getting sex, money, and power, or power, for saying any of this was true. They had no motive to invent it. So for me, that makes me think this really happened. And I can't see how a fictional character, or somebody that we only know just a shady amount about, because all this was legendary development, as Paul is putting forth, could somehow become the most influential human being in history, unless something like something dramatic like the resurrection took place. Let's go back to Star Wars for a second. Does any of us here really believe that 2,000 years from now, a fictional character like Luke Skywalker is going to be the most influential human being over the previous 2,000 years?
Okay, go ahead, Paul.
You said a lot of things there, so I want to try and go back and remember them one at a time. But I do have things to talk about with all of them. So the first is that you were talking about, I never posited that the writers of the Gospels invented anything. What I feel like the writers of the Gospels did was they codified decades of oral tradition. Now, in your book, you specifically call out Christians and saying, you know what, the early people didn't have a New Testament. They listened to the oral tradition. So it seems like you agree with me that those oral traditions were around, and that 20 years later, pretty much anyone could have written
But that
them
doesn't
down.
mean that the oral traditions are wrong, because there's eyewitness
No,
details
but
throughout them.
But certainly what I don't need, you're positing why would the writers invent it? And I don't think the writers invented anything. I think they were just writing down what was believed. And that seems to be what you said in the book as well. So
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just saying the Hollywood Heroes book isn't really doing a lot of apologetics in that regard. That's from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, my other book. But my main point here is to say that they're not inventing it, and they witnessed a lot of this because there's eyewitness details throughout the text. So it's not like decades later they said, hey, let's take all these legendary stories and put them into a biography. These people either were eyewitnesses or knew eyewitnesses in the case of Luke, and then they wrote it down. And I think you can show that by looking at what's actually in the text.
So you and I drastically agree. I don't think any of the gospel writers are eyewitnesses of anything, but I want to go to, you kind of threw a bunch of things in there, so we can come back to that if you're interested. We can talk about whether the gospel writers knew it, witnessed anything. But then you also threw to essentially to J. Warner Wallace's Person of Interest book, which is, this Jesus had the greatest influence in history, therefore something. I don't know therefore what, but what I would love to hear, and I would from you or from Jay, from Jim. Where's that threshold? So you talked about, well, Jesus came along at a certain time, and he influenced culture, and he influenced music, and he influenced all these things. And a lot of scientists were Christians, and great. But where's that's correlation? Not where. How can you show me that it's causation, not merely correlation? Obviously, when science came into fruition, most of the money and most of the research was happening in churches. So, where is the point? And if Jesus hadn't existed, you'd have to admit that someone would be the most popular person. If not Jesus, someone else would be. Where do we find some kind of magic line to say, oh, this much popularity can be explained, but this level of Jesus popularity means divine? Like, what is in this gap that turns popularity from just being Beatles popular to,
yeah, well, it's a good
divine?
question. It's not like physics, Paul, I don't think, or mathematics. You don't say, oh, once you hit this point, you got, this guy is God. No, we're not saying that. This is just one argument out of many. It's circumstantial that to have the most influential human being in history be a man from an obscure corner of the Roman Empire who never wrote a book, never traveled more than 200 miles from his home, never actually led an army, held political office, never did any of the things that we would consider today to be great, and yet he's the center of human history. How does this happen unless something dramatic like a resurrection takes place? It seems that
what if it was just a belief in a resurrection? What is different? What's the difference when you talked about cause and effect earlier? When you see the effect, the cause could be either that he was resurrected, or that people sincerely believe he resurrected. Would those not create the exact same cause?
If people sincerely believed and were mistaken, but it would have been very easy to stop Christianity in its tracks in the very beginning. It would have just go to the tomb and take out his body. Would have been over.
What if he was thrown in a mass grave like almost most of them were?
Well, according
and there wasn't a tomb that they
according
knew
to
where
the
he was.
best evidence we have, he wasn't put in a mass grave, and his tomb was claimed to be empty. And the Romans and the Jews could have, if they were the ones that disposed the body, even in a mass grave, they could have said, "Let's go get the body and show everybody."
Decades
No.
later?
This happened very early. Even Bart Ehrman from UNC Chapel Hill, who's probably the top skeptic in the world today, says the earliest evidence for the resurrection, even though he doesn't believe in the resurrection, is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, which is an ancient creed that he says goes all the way back within a year or so of the supposed event. So
I actually had Bart on my channel last week to talk about Gary Habermas saying that very thing, and Bart disagrees. Bart says that's not what he believes.
Well, maybe he's changing his tune, because he did believe that at one point. It's an early creed. In fact, there's 41 creeds in the New Testament that go way back to the events themselves.
I would say that, in a way, we've moved into the territory, obviously, of debating the biblical evidence and everything else. It's interesting, though, that for you, Jesus, I guess you're willing to grant, presumably, Paul, that Jesus has had a massive cultural influence and everything else. So you're not denying any of that. Your view is, though, that doesn't elevate him to the status of divine just on the basis of the extraordinary influence that this relatively unknown person, in his day has gone on to have.
Right. As an interesting example, like when the book Person of Interest book came out, Jim was talking a lot about how we could recreate the Bible from other sources. So I took it upon myself to recreate Star Wars Episode 4 entirely from clips from other movies. And you can actually go on my YouTube channel and watch a half-hour version of, Star Wars Episode 4 without a single clip from anything that Lucasfilm ever made. It's just the fact that something becomes popular enough that it becomes referenced and referenced and referenced just means that it became popular. It doesn't mean that there's anything,
Yeah, I'm just wondering why Christianity would become popular in the ancient world when you could be killed for becoming a Christian.
Well, you could, but again, I don't know how much Justin wants us to go into the history, but that was happening sporadically, and it was terrible that it was happening, but it didn't happen to everyone. Most Christians, lived their lives just fine, and then, of course, when most Christianity grew in the 4th century, it became a protected thing. I understand that it lived some dark days. And again, I don't know how many supposed witnesses there were to the resurrection and what happened to them. So again, it's tough to know. What's the difference? For me, it always comes down to, can you differentiate between people sincerely believing and being wrong, or the actual event happening? And I have yet to see what the magic element is that requires that it be true. If you're making a probabilistic argument, that's
yeah,
one
well,
thing. But I'm not
I agree with
quite
you,
sure.
Paul. Nothing's required to be true in this regard. This is an historical event, so we're dealing in probability. And I agree that just because Jesus is the most influential human being in history doesn't mean he's divine. I agree with that. It's just one piece of evidence among many.
We're going to have to leave it there, and I'm afraid, yeah,